They called it a routine patrol, the kind of diplomatic surveillance mission that veterans slept through and rookies romanticized over hot cups of instant coffee in underheated orbital barracks. Captain Ileana Voss, 43 years old, scarred more in soul than skin, had led her crew through over 100 such assignments, each more redundant than the last, each leaving her with a deeper ache in her chest, a weariness no sleep could cure. Space had grown quiet over the decades, too quiet. The Orion Accords had muted most interstellar aggression, but not tension. Underneath the sterile peace, systems were arming, whispering, calculating. And Earth had gone silent. Not the kind of silence that meant peace. The kind of silence that tasted like blood in the mouth and smelled like fuel before a fire. For 21 years, humanity had withdrawn from galactic politics, closed its embassies, recalled its fleets, even dismantled the interstellar communication relays that once tethered it to the rest of the civilized systems. No one knew why. No one dared to ask. The humans, once loud, chaotic, brash to the point of infuriation, had simply stopped talking. Theories spread like virus spores through the neural networks. Economic collapse, biowar, AI rebellion, extinction. But none stuck. There were no refugee vessels, no warning signals, no scavenger traffic, nothing. Just black silence behind Soul's curtain. And then the signal came. Just one. No message, no encryption, no introduction. A ripple. A scream of energy across quantum bands that hadn't been touched in years. Every listening post in the galaxy froze. It was simple, a single harmonic pulse so precise it bypassed every known firewall, resonated in every species' unique auditory cognition range, and triggered a latent protocol buried deep inside ancient treaties. Level Omega Clearance, Human Emergency Authority. It meant only one thing. Earth was speaking again. And this time it wasn't requesting aid. It was summoning. Captain Voss felt it before the instruments confirmed it. A low-frequency pressure in her bones, the taste of copper on her tongue, like the air just before a lightning strike. Her second-in-command, a Rasari hybrid named Thal, whispered, "By the void, it's them." He didn't need to say more. Every crew member turned toward the projection bay as the signal unfolded into form. Not sound, not code, but memory. Images flickered, cities burning under alien flags, children pulled from collapsed shelters, ships igniting in orbit while Terran soldiers held the line with rifles decades behind enemy tech. And then silence again. Just one image remaining, a child, covered in ash, clutching a flag half-torn, eyes burning not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. Resolve. The message had no words, but it spoke louder than any declaration of war. Humanity had not been defeated. It had been preparing, watching, waiting. Captain Voss turned to her crew, the memory of Earth's past sufferings now bleeding through their consciousness, not as data, but as pain. "Alert command," she said, voice hoarse. "The silence is broken." What they didn't know, what the galaxy would soon understand, is that the silence wasn't retreat. It was strategy. It was restraint. Because when humanity finally speaks, it never whispers. It roars. And now, every empire that had scoffed at Terran withdrawal, every admiral who had deleted Earth from threat projections, every politician who had profited from their absence, would remember why you never, ever push a species that builds its legends in fire and loss. The galaxy had grown used to peace. But peace is only quiet when the wolves are asleep. And humanity, those eternal wolves, had just opened their eyes. One signal was enough. The news spread faster than light, not by relay or broadcast, but by the primal instinct of fear, the kind that doesn't wait for orders or explanation. On the diplomatic moon of Iscanter, envoys from the Jurelian Concord broke mid-negotiation to scramble their high council. On the industrial asteroids of Keth, production lines ground to a halt as holograms of the Earth signal were projected on every surface, every console, every mind. Even in the deep-fold sectors of the Zin Empire, where no human foot had ever touched soil, the Empress paused her daily communion to stare at the pulses echo-etched into spacetime. And amid it all, no words were spoken, because the memory delivered in that signal was not a transmission, it was an infection. Each race saw their own past crimes against Earth, not as history, but as relived experience. The bombardments they had justified. The sanctions. The betrayals. The invasions. Each species had their own slice of guilt stitched into the fabric of the memory. And for the first time in galactic history, shared shame echoed louder than war drums. Back aboard the Terran remnant patrol ship Solstice Dawn, Captain Voss stood motionless at the edge of the holotable, watching as fleet telemetry lit up like a storm. Hundreds of dormant Terran satellites, long presumed dead, flickered to life with old-world energy signatures, nuclear, magnetic, fusion-augmented, and something else, something no one recognized. Systems born of human desperation and brilliance. No one knew what Earth had built during its silence, but now the stars trembled at the implications. Thal, still pale from the echo of the memory, whispered, "That child in the vision, who was she?" And Voss, without blinking, answered with a truth even she didn't know how she knew. "She's what they became." Because that child, standing defiant in ruins, wasn't just symbolic. She was a projection of the new Terran doctrine. Endurance beyond collapse. Not vengeance, not conquest, survival as principle, justice as inheritance. The galaxy had expected a broken people, perhaps humbled, perhaps extinct. What answered instead was a species that had looked into the abyss and built a home there. Quietly, efficiently, ruthlessly. And the systems that had preyed upon Terran weakness for a generation were now the ones broadcasting emergency ceasefire pings into the void, hoping, begging, for a response. But none came. The signal had not invited conversation. It had given warning. The silence of 21 years had been a forging process, a recalibration of a species that once burned bright but erratic. Now it burned cold and focused. Voss knew this wasn't the start of a war, not yet. This was a test. Earth was waiting to see who would respond, who would bow, who would resist, and who would remember. In the diplomatic chambers of the Valoran spires, Grand Strategist Karotan, whose fleets once glassed Terran outposts in the Tarsus Rift, collapsed into his chair with trembling hands. "We should have killed them," he muttered. "Not beaten. Not shamed. Killed." His aides said nothing. They were already evacuating families. Because they understood the weight of a message like that. It wasn't a declaration of power. It was a promise. A reckoning long delayed. The galaxy thought it had tamed the wild fire of humanity. But you don't tame a storm. You just try to survive it when it returns. And return it had, without fanfare, without demand, just that single terrifying signal. One note. One child's stare. One unbearable silence. And the memory that would haunt every soul who had once raised a hand against Earth. As the memory ripple still echoed across the void, reaching deep into the systems that had long buried their crimes beneath diplomacy and historical revisionism, one truth rose like smoke from smoldering ruin. The galaxy had not just underestimated Earth. It had forgotten what Earth had paid. In the decades following the War of Attrition, humanity had not simply withdrawn from politics, they had withdrawn from mourning. Earth, once home to 10 billion vibrant voices, now orbited in mourning silence around a sun dimmed by the collective weight of memory. The cities of Berlin, Tokyo, New York, and Lagos had become shrines. Each corner a sacred graveyard. Each street a scar etched with names, not of heroes, but of families of children of hope turned to ash. The Terran coalition hadn't collapsed. It had folded inward like a dying star, concentrating mass and memory, until what remained was a species no longer willing to beg for unity. Voss remembered it all too well. Her brother had died in the orbital siege over Cassini Station, his last message a whisper through broken comms. Don't forgive them. Her mother perished not in war, but in the silence afterward, when the lights stopped coming back on and the food shipments never arrived. And she herself had been among the last Terrans evacuated off-world before the quarantine lines were drawn. Back when the rest of the galaxy declared Earth unstable and unfit for reintegration. A phrase spoken in polished conference halls while human children died in freezing shelters. What the other species didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that humanity hadn't been quiet because they were hiding. They had been rebuilding something stronger than fleets, deadlier than bombs. Conviction. Not the kind born of nationalism or pride, but the kind that only survivors understand. The kind that buries its roots in soil soaked in loss and grows upward toward justice. When the first signal echoed, it wasn't a threat, it was a mirror. It forced the galaxy to remember what it had done, and in doing so, it reminded humanity of what it had become. Voss now looked over reports from scattered Terran watchposts, themselves thought destroyed decades ago. But they had endured. Deep within asteroid belts, beneath oceans of uninhabited worlds, inside dormant trade satellites, human outposts had survived in silence, carrying out one directive: wait, observe, remember. And now they were waking. No commands were issued. They didn't need to be. Each station, each agent, each buried AI construct reacted as if they'd been rehearsing for this moment every day of their hidden lives. And in a way they had. They'd watched the enemy species celebrate their false victory. They'd seen war criminals become senators. They'd recorded every broken treaty, every lie, every time Earth was spoken of as a memory rather than a warning. And now the signal had given them what they needed: legitimacy, a shared awakening, a righteous cause. Somewhere in the outer shell of the Omega Rim, an ancient Terran dreadnought, the UNS Devotion, once thought vaporized, rose from the shadow of a dead moon. Its systems lit one by one, not with the war codes of the past, but with something newer, colder, more efficient. Voss stared at its transmission data and realized it had never been destroyed. It had been hiding like all of them, waiting. And now it was ready. The Devotion sent no words, just a timestamp, a countdown. 12 days. The galaxy had 12 days to respond, not to Earth, but to itself. Because this time, humanity wasn't asking to be heard. They were making the galaxy listen. And this time, silence would not protect anyone. 12 days. That was all the galaxy had. Not 12 days to prepare for invasion, not 12 days to negotiate peace, but 12 days to understand what it had done, what it had become, while humanity grieved in the dark. For the first time in living memory, every major power convened emergency councils not for strategy, but for soul-searching. On the crystalline towers of Ethros Prime, the Valari High Singers performed mourning hymns for Terran lives they had once considered expendable. In the cold metropolises of the Drex Combine, where Terran DNA had once been harvested like cattle under covert experimentation, their science guilds now scrambled to erase records, knowing that no deletion could absolve them from what was coming. On distant Caraxis, where human prisoners were paraded in chains for centuries as trophies of war, 1,000 statues were toppled overnight. Not in shame, but in fear. The silence following the signal was worse than any declaration of war, because war could be predicted. But this was judgment. Earth had said nothing further, not a single word since that echo. The UNS Devotion continued its slow, spectral approach toward the galactic core, escorted by a growing number of Terran vessels emerging from all corners of space like ghosts from a shared nightmare. They came in silence, all bearing the same emblem, once Earth's flag, now altered. The planet, yes, still in the center, but surrounded not by stars or laurels, but names. Names of colonies lost, ships destroyed, families erased. It wasn't a flag, it was a ledger, and it demanded a reckoning. On the 11th day, Captain Voss stood aboard the Solstice Dawn, reviewing a flood of diplomatic pleas from former enemies. Some begged for forgiveness, others offered reparations. A few even volunteered to stand trial for war crimes committed decades ago. But the Terran fleet gave no reply. Not out of arrogance, but clarity. The time for bargaining had long passed. This wasn't about politics. It was about memory. Voss turned to her crew, each one with their own story of loss. A pilot whose sister had died in the oxygen riots of Europa. A medic who'd served in the fallout zones of New Mumbai. A comms officer who had never met her parents, only visited their grave markers in virtual memorials. This was humanity now, not broken but defined by loss. Every survivor carried within them a scream that had been buried too long. And now, it rose in silence, louder than any weapon. Day 10. In orbit around the former Terran colony of Varine, long since absorbed into the Zin Empire, human sympathizers, once forced into hiding, emerged carrying pieces of old Earth tech. Not weapons, not tools, but recordings. Images. Audio. A mother's final lullaby to her child. A soldier's last journal entry from a trench lit by plasma fire. A teacher's lesson in the ruins of a bombed-out school. telling students to remember what kindness felt like. These were their weapons now, truth and pain, shared like wildfire across every galactic network. And still Earth said nothing. No ultimatums. No threats. Just presence. On day 9, a delegation from the Varnak Alliance tried to physically intercept one of the awakening Terran dreadnoughts. Their ships were not destroyed. They were boarded. And then silence. Not a single scream. Not a single escape pod. The dreadnought simply continued on course, untouched, unfazed, as if it had swatted a fly. This silence was not absence, it was discipline. Humanity had learned not just to endure, but to wait, to plan, to rise not in fury but with purpose. Now the purpose was unfolding, inch by inch, through the weight of a million memories. The galaxy, for the first time, was being made to feel the grief it had outsourced to Earth for decades. 12 days. One signal. No more mercy. And the closer the clock ticked toward zero, the more everyone began to understand that humanity had changed in ways no one could predict. And yet, what none of them knew, what even Voss herself had not yet realized, was that the signal was not Earth's first move. It had been the last warning. The real reckoning was already in motion. On the 7th day, when the silence had become unbearable, when entire civilizations trembled not because of what they saw, but because of what they felt closing in, cold, patient, inevitable, the twist arrived like a blade between ribs. Humanity had never been alone. Not entirely. The signal wasn't just a message from Earth. It was a beacon, a prearranged signal flare tied to a secret pact buried so deeply in the fabric of spacetime that not even Earth's enemies had suspected it. In the final days of the War of Attrition, as Earth's fleets were pushed to collapse and its colonies were slaughtered one by one, a final directive was enacted, Project Sable. It had been dismissed even by Terran leadership at the time as desperate fantasy, a last-ditch collaboration between the few alien species who had refused to take part in the war against Earth. A handful of races shunned by the dominant galactic powers, driven into exile or silence for their defiance. These species, minuscule in military strength, irrelevant in diplomacy, had seen something in humanity no one else had. Not savagery, not chaos, but a mirror. They had witnessed Earth's fall not as justice, but as a preview of their own future. And in Earth's darkest hour, they had made a promise, not of rescue, but of preservation. While the galaxy rejoiced in Earth's defeat, these allies had helped scatter Terran minds, genetic archives, and tactical AIs into hidden pockets of space, deep-fold libraries, temporal caches, even inside abandoned mining moons disguised as lifeless rocks. Earth's silence hadn't been solitude. It had been coordination. And now, the signal had activated every one of those caches simultaneously, not just waking the remnants of Earth's old power, but fusing them with the knowledge, technology, and cultures of dozens of outcast races who had quietly evolved together in the dark. They weren't a human fleet anymore. They were something new, something the galaxy had never accounted for. The Concord of Ash. A union forged in shared trauma, co-developed over 21 years in the places the galaxy had forgotten existed. When the signal pulsed, it didn't just awaken Terran ships, it awakened those allies. And now they were emerging. Ships of non-human design, pulsing with hybrid energy signatures that confused every known scanner. Vessels piloted by warriors and scholars who had waited in the shadows alongside humanity, building not for conquest, but for balance. Captain Voss stared at the live tactical feed as these new ships emerged from folds in space like ghosts in formation. Curved Xylan stealth cruisers escorting reconstructed Terran battleships, Draken memory carriers broadcasting decades of recorded war crimes in unbroken loops, Calvethi mindarcs bending enemy communication relays into loops of grief and memory. The galaxy watched in horror as the past it tried to erase rose again. Not as revenge, but as testimony. This was the twist no one saw coming. Earth had not risen alone. And more importantly, Earth had never planned to retaliate with war. It had planned to force the truth into the open, to unbury the atrocities no one wanted to speak of, to confront the abusers not with bullets, but with evidence, with living witnesses, with the shattered fragments of species who had all suffered in silence. And that was the real danger. Not weapons. Not dreadnoughts. But truth made unignorable. Voss felt her breath catch as she realized the strategy. There would be no preemptive strike, no grand battle to win or lose. There would be exposure. The kind that undoes empires. The kind that topples dynasties. The kind that makes war criminals hang themselves in their own palaces, not out of shame, but out of terror for what the people would do when they finally saw. The Concord of Ash was not here to destroy the galaxy. It was here to change it forever. And at its center stood humanity, not because they were the strongest, but because they had endured long enough to outlive every lie told about them. The twist was not in Earth's power. It was in its alliance. And now, for the first time since the War of Attrition, the galaxy had no idea what came next. Because the game had changed. And the ones who had been written out of history had just picked up the pen. The galaxy staggered under the weight of its own breath, like a criminal suddenly forced to face the full trial of memory in public view, naked, exposed, and far too late for repentance. The emergence of the Concord of Ash hadn't just ruptured the illusion of Earth's isolation. It had shattered the entire galactic narrative that had kept billions content with the idea that justice was a luxury, not a right. The veil had dropped, and what lay beneath was terrifying not because of its strength, but because of its precision. In the trading halls of the Trinari Confederacy, ministers collapsed as private records from 50 years ago played openly on their public broadcasts. Video of forced relocations, sanctioned starvation, backroom deals that turned entire Terran refugee arcs into bargaining chips. These files had never been hacked. They had been recorded by the Concord's agents years ago, archived, and timed to be released now. The Senate of the Drex Combine, which had always claimed their role in Earth's collapse was minimal, was ripped apart when a live feed from a Concord envoy projected proof of Drex biological experiments on surviving Terran orphans, detailing every grafted nerve, every scream, every false consent form. Even their citizens, loyal through fear, now rioted in horror. But the most crushing effect wasn't these revelations. It was who they came from. When victims finally speak in unison, the sound doesn't resemble noise. It resembles thunder. On the 6th day before the countdown reached zero, Concord forces executed a planet-wide blockade. Not of a military hub, but of the prestigious Galactic Diplomatic Academy on Kavaris, the symbol of supposed neutrality in a biased system. They didn't fire. They simply forced all comms open and played 12 hours of raw, unfiltered footage. The last transmission of Earth's evacuation fleet being fired upon by so-called peacekeeping patrols. Children burning in atmospheric breach because the shield codes were never sent. Terran medics pleading for ceasefire in 43 languages, all ignored. No commentary. Just the truth. Left raw like a wound reopened. And all across the galaxy, civilians began to ask themselves the question no leader could answer. If this was what Earth survived, what would we have become in their place? Panic bled upward. On the mineral-rich planet of Galteros, the ruling elite self-immolated rather than face what they'd long feared. Earth's vengeance would not be a fleet in the sky. It would be history carved into every public screen, every schoolbook, every waking thought. But still the Terran fleets held position. The Concord of Ash advanced slowly, methodically, announcing no demands. Because this wasn't about terms. It was about narrative control. It was about taking back the story. Captain Voss, watching all of this unfold from her command deck, knew she was no longer just a captain. She was a witness, one of many placed across a galaxy that had been given a final test. Acknowledge the truth, or collapse beneath the weight of denial. Her own crew had started to change too, not in orders but in eyes. They looked at the stars now not as distance, but as accountability. There was nowhere left to run from what had been done. And those who had mocked Earth's silence now clung to the very idea of silence, begging the Concord to stop broadcasting, to let the shame fade, to offer them the mercy of forgetting. But forgetting was the poison that had made this future possible. And Earth, along with every voice in the Concord, was done letting amnesia be policy. The galaxy tried to breathe again. But every inhale now carried the scent of everything it had buried. And in that choking air, a realization finally began to settle like dust in ruined cities. This wasn't the beginning of humanity's revenge. It was the beginning of the galaxy's reckoning. And the countdown still ticked on. They were no longer soldiers, scientists, or diplomats. The ones now stepping forward to represent Earth and the Concord of Ash were something far more terrifying to the old guard of the galaxy. Survivors who had been children when the worlds burned. They were the orphans, the exiled, the forgotten. Raised on stories whispered in bombed-out basements, fed on rations salvaged from wrecked ships, educated in silence by old AI instructors or fugitive elders who had nothing left but the truth. And now they were grown. What the galaxy had assumed would become a generation of broken humans had instead become the most dangerous force imaginable. Leaders who had never known comfort, who had grown up knowing only betrayal, who carried every scar with clarity instead of trauma. Across the galaxy, these children-turned-commanders began to emerge, not on battlefields but on communication networks, on memory feeds, on truth archives that were impossible to intercept or suppress. One such figure, Alina Kor, daughter of 2 Terran engineers executed during the siege of Lyrian Station, appeared on over 4,000 planetary networks simultaneously, not through hacking, but through access granted willingly by the oppressed, the silenced, the ones who had watched from the shadows and waited for someone to speak for them. Her face was calm, her voice not angry but devastatingly measured. She did not promise war. She simply read the names of the dead. For 6 hours. Without pause. Every name confirmed and documented. Every life erased by the hands of governments now trembling behind their golden shields. By the end, systems were weeping, not because of the threat, but because of the humanity. The realization that Earth had raised its children not for vengeance, but for justice. Justice sharpened in the dark and delivered in the light. The Concord of Ash didn't just consist of hybrid fleets and AI constructs. It was also composed of these children, raised in secret enclaves scattered across forgotten worlds, trained not only in warfare but in philosophy, diplomacy, ethics. They were not conquerors. They were keepers of memory. And in their hands now rested the fate of a galaxy that had tried to erase them. Captain Voss watched one such transmission in silence, her own memories blurring with the present. She remembered Alina as a toddler, half-starved, pulled from a refugee pod by Voss herself during her early days in the Outer Patrol Corps. She had given her a blanket and a piece of chocolate, one of the last she had from Earth. Now, decades later, that same child was speaking for a species and an alliance born from ash. And it was working. Empires began to fracture. Not from missiles, but from truth. Soldiers laid down arms not from fear, but from guilt. Young citizens raised on propaganda stared in disbelief as truth archives dismantled the myths they were fed. And some, too many to count, began to whisper a dangerous phrase. What if we were wrong? In the halls of power, this phrase was treated like treason. In the streets, it became gospel. The Concord's power wasn't its fleets. It was its children. Those who had nothing left to lose, who had built futures from ruins and were now unafraid to speak. Their eyes held no hatred, only remembrance. And in them, the galaxy saw its future, if only it could muster the courage to face the past. The countdown ticked. 5 days remaining. And still no demands from Earth. No ultimatums. Just truth. Just silence. Just children who had survived everything, now daring the galaxy to prove it had a conscience. On the 4th day before the countdown's end, when hope and dread strangled the same breath, the Concord revealed what lay at the heart of their resurgence. Not a weapon, not a superstructure, but a planet so blacked out from records, maps, and memory that it had become myth even among the few who once knew its name. Silence. That was what they called it now, though once it had been Earth's final colony before the Great Betrayal. A terraformed moon in the outer reaches, too small for interest, too distant for rescue. It was here that the Concord's first breath had taken form, where exiled Terrans, broken species, and the last protectors of honor among the stars had converged in secret, building beneath the soil, beneath the scars of orbital bombardment that never stopped burning in its sky. Silence wasn't just a refuge, it was a forge. Its air had been poisoned until restructured by human-engineered biofilters. Its gravity unstable until recalibrated by a fusion of Xylan technology and old Terran mining drives. Its very core unstable, threatening collapse every 7 cycles. But they had made it home. Not because it was safe, but because it was like them, damaged, abandoned, and stubborn enough to survive. On Silence, children were raised not with lullabies but with history. Every building was a school. Every corridor a reminder. Statues were not built to glorify generals, but to honor lost civilians, the unarmed, the silenced, the forgotten. And when the signal had been sent 12 days ago, it had come not from Earth, but from silence, the true heart of the Concord. This revelation shattered the galaxy's last assumption, that Earth had been the command center. No, Earth was the symbol. Silence was the will. And now, the planet itself stood revealed, emerging from the cosmic dust of its hiding place like a scar pulled into the light. Every system trained their eyes on it. Every analyst ran projections. Every war council updated risk assessments. But what terrified them all wasn't its orbital defense array, though formidable, or its stealth fleet stationed like wolves in a silent ring. It was the fact that silence was broadcasting. Not just information, but art, music, poetry, recordings of the old world, children singing in languages long thought extinct, survivors reading their parents' last messages, a mural being painted live, stroke by stroke, across the side of a tower built from scavenged hulls of refugee ships, and etched above the city gates of the main settlement, a phrase now seared into the minds of every being in the galaxy. We do not seek to destroy, we seek to be remembered. This, more than anything, unraveled the hearts of those watching. For all their war games and predictive simulations, no one had accounted for this. Empathy as a weapon. Truth not wielded with malice, but with unwavering clarity. It disarmed more effectively than plasma and struck deeper than fire. Across once hostile worlds, uprisings began, not of violence but of memory. In the Zin core systems, Terran captives once used for experimentation were released, not by military order, but by scientists too ashamed to continue. In the Valari border states, once fervent war supporters threw their medals into the streets and begged for amnesty from the movement they now swore allegiance to. The Concord didn't gloat, didn't claim victories. It simply kept broadcasting, like a wound refusing to scab until cleansed. And in the eyes of every citizen across the stars, the same silent question bloomed like frost. If this is what we did to Earth, what else have we become? And still the countdown ticked. For days. No weapons fired. No terms offered. Just the slow, agonizing reflection of a galaxy forced to face the mirror. And silence, that wounded moon, now glowed like a lighthouse in a storm. A reminder that pain does not end civilizations. Denial does. And Earth, through silence, had chosen to teach instead of kill, for now. As the countdown reached its third day, something unimaginable occurred. Something that no strategist, no galactic wargame, no battle-hardened admiral had even dared to theorize. Warships, entire fleets, began to defect. Not small skirmisher pods or disgruntled mercenaries. No, these were capital-class dreadnoughts, cruisers, and carriers belonging to some of the most powerful factions in the galaxy. The first to turn was the Vanguard of Clarity, a Valari flagship known for its brutal efficiency, and once tasked with intercepting Concord transmissions. It broadcast a single message before cutting contact with its high command. We remember Terra. The shockwave this sent through the Valari Empire's command was seismic, not just because of the loss of firepower, but because of what followed. 10 more ships, then 20, then entire battalions breaking formation mid-patrol, refusing to fire, turning instead toward silence, not as enemies but as pilgrims. What had started as isolated ripples soon became tidal. From the frost-hardened fleets of the Xylen to the sapphire-cloaked armadas of the Androni coalition, crews began making their decisions not based on orders, but on conscience. Many of these soldiers weren't even born during the Terran Purge. They had grown up with one version of history. The version scrubbed clean, rewritten to justify power, to paint Earth as the aggressor, as the wild, unmanageable threat that had to be erased for the good of the galaxy. But now, watching the broadcasts from silence, hearing the lullabies in forgotten languages, witnessing the forgiveness offered not with arrogance but sorrow, they couldn't hold the lie anymore. Captains wept at their consoles. Pilots removed the insignias from their uniforms. Commanders stared at holograms of the children on silence, trying to imagine what it meant to survive, to keep breathing, when your entire species had been hunted, humiliated, and scattered across cold stars. The moment that marked the true fracture came when the Carithian, a Xin War mothership, the pride of their species, rumored to be controlled by an AI core carved from the mind of their last empress, turned without warning and jumped coordinates, arriving in orbit above Silence. No threats. No speeches. Just one broadcast looped over every open frequency. A poem, ancient and human, translated across 100 dialects. We were not made to conquer stars, but to understand them. With that, the Carithian shut down all weapons, extended its docking bridge toward Silence, and waited. The galaxy stopped breathing. The ones who remained loyal to the old orders, the factions who had clung to their power, who had built their strength on the back of Earth's supposed villainy, watched in horror as their own fleets hesitated. Not because they lacked discipline, but because their hearts were no longer with them. The war that had been centuries in the making had just been unraveled not by superior weapons or strategic genius, but by memory, pain, and the undeniable weight of truth. No Concord officer demanded surrender. No voice from Silence asked for allegiance. They simply bore witness, and let the galaxy decide for itself. And in those final hours of the third day, as the number of defecting fleets outnumbered the loyal ones, one bitter truth could no longer be ignored. The war had ended long ago. They just hadn't stopped fighting it. Now, with warships turning, soldiers weeping, and commanders resigning, the galaxy found itself not staring down the barrel of Concord's wrath, but choking on the magnitude of its own regret. Yet still, the Concorde made no move. The signal remained unchanged. The countdown continued. Not as a threat but as a reminder. Time is running out. Not for war, but for change. By the fourth day, the silence was no longer a tactic. It had become the loudest language in the galaxy. Entire civilizations, once fortified in their pride, their belief in their untouchable legacies, began to unravel under the weight of their own narratives. This wasn't a demand for reparations, not a declaration of vengeance or power play masked as diplomacy. It was something worse, something deeper. It was a mirror. And for the first time in generations, the galaxy had no choice but to look at its own face. On the broadcast channels, now flooded by millions of vessels across sectors, the signal continued, unchanged, unfiltered. A child's voice speaking in Terran Standard, reciting an old Earth story about a garden that no one took care of, and how the flowers stopped blooming because everyone thought it was someone else's responsibility. No guns. No orders. Just a voice, young and unthreatening, cutting deeper than any weapon ever could. On the Hydraxian capital ring, the Chancellor of the Unified Front stepped onto the floor of their parliament, removed her ceremonial mask, and spoke words not heard in her culture since its founding. We were wrong. We believed power needed purity. And so we destroyed what we didn't understand. And in doing so we destroyed ourselves. Her declaration was broadcast instantly, not just to her own people, but voluntarily echoed across the networks of other worlds. One by one, as if some unseen tide were moving them, leaders began to speak, not as rulers, but as humans once spoke when their knees hit the ground after wars they never wanted to fight. The Valari Grand Elder, who had once given the order to eradicate Earth's orbiting moon bases, addressed his nation from a cryobed in his twilight years, tears rolling down cheeks that had never known emotion publicly. They didn't vanish. We erased them. And now, their silence echoes louder than our greatest victories. On Karen, the spire world of steel and storm, its media networks shut down entertainment feeds and looped a simple visual. The Earth flag, burned and broken, reforming piece by piece, over and over again. Artists began to paint. Musicians composed ballads in forgotten Terran scales. Poets, warriors, farmers, AI historians, all joined in a chorus the galaxy hadn't known it still had the capacity for. Remorse. But even in the flood of apologies, silence remained still. No acknowledgement. No retaliation. No response. Just the signal. Just the countdown. That absence of reply, that refusal to gloat or forgive, was not cold. It was honest. Concord wasn't asking for apologies. They weren't even asking to be welcomed back. They were letting the galaxy reckon with itself. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. And as day 4 stretched into its evening, with stars shifting over Silence and tens of thousands of ships hovering above it in reverent orbit, something strange began to happen. Civilians, scientists, even children aboard other planets started to mimic the signal. Not in mockery but in tribute. A planetary colony on the edge of the Duraxis belt held a moment of planetary silence, an entire world going still for 6 minutes as they played the Concorde signal from every tower. A mining station on the edge of ZT-9 began carving human names into its steel walls. Names from Earth's lost records, names of people whose bones were never buried, whose stories had been scrubbed from galactic history. And above all, they sent transmissions, not from governments, but from individuals. One by one. I'm sorry. We never asked who you were. Only what you could become for us. I had a Terran great-grandmother. I was told she was the shame of our bloodline. I'm ashamed I believed that. We want to know you. If you'll let us. A child's drawing, sent from the Androni School of Youth, showed Earth and Silence side by side, with a bridge connecting them, held by stick figure hands. These weren't declarations of surrender or formal reparations. They were something purer, something real. Humanity hadn't returned to punish the galaxy. They had returned to make it remember. And in that remembering, maybe, just maybe, healing could begin. But still, the countdown ticked. As the final hours of the countdown drew near, an unspoken dread settled like dust over the entire galaxy. No species, no empire, no corner of space was untouched by the sensation that something monumental was coming, and yet no one could predict what. What would humanity do once the last second ticked away? Would there be retribution? A release of the technological fury they were rumored to have perfected in the silence of their exile? Would stars be extinguished, networks corrupted, histories rewritten? No one knew. But they feared. And they waited. Orbiting above the planet now officially called Silence, tens of thousands of ships remained still, their weapons powered down, their engines humming low like prayers being whispered into the void. Across every inhabited system, people gathered in squares, domes, biodomes, megastructures, or wherever their species called home, staring at the time display transmitted by the human signal. Even newborn species with no cultural understanding of Earth, or the war that once buried it, instinctively knew this was sacred. This was history in motion. And then in one breathless moment, the countdown reached 0. The signal that had pulsed like a heartbeat across the stars cut to black. Silence fell. Not the symbolic name of the planet, but the real thing. No message. No retaliation. No reaction. Just an aching, bone-deep stillness. For 7 seconds, the galaxy held its breath. And then, the black screen was replaced, not by a weapon or a declaration, but by a single looping piece of footage. It wasn't grand. It wasn't violent. It was simple. It showed a Terran park bathed in morning sun, where children of every race, human, hybrid, and alien, played together beneath cherry blossom trees. No walls. No uniforms. Just laughter. A dog chasing a drone. An Androni child holding hands with a human boy. A teacher watching them, smiling. And then a voice spoke, not synthetic, not commanding. Soft. Familiar. Human. It was the voice of a woman. We were never gone. We simply remembered who we were. And waited until you remembered too. The footage looped again. And again. No demands. No conditions. Just a memory. A gift. The message was clear. Humanity had nothing more to prove. They had already transcended vengeance. This wasn't a show of restraint. It was a show of wisdom, of discipline, of evolution. And that revelation shattered the galaxy more than any warhead ever could. Because they all realized something at once. Humanity didn't return for revenge. They returned to offer a second chance. Not to themselves, but to everyone else. In the following hours, sectors that had been enemies for centuries opened borders. Armies disbanded voluntarily. Diplomatic envoys flooded the systems near Silence, not to bargain, but to learn. Galactic historians scrambled to rewrite records. Not to glorify Concorde, but to correct the lie they'd all accepted. That Earth had been weak, emotional, chaotic. The truth was now undeniable. Humanity had mastered the one force the galaxy had failed to understand: restraint. In that moment, they became more than a species. They became a mirror to everyone else. And still, Silence offered nothing but the signal. The park, the children, the voice. Peace had been extended, Not with words, but with a memory of who they once were. And now who they could be again. The countdown hadn't been a threat. It was an invitation. In the wake of the signal, after the looping footage had etched itself into the consciousness of billions, a quiet transformation unfolded across the stars. One not enforced by power, but inspired by humility. The galaxy, long fractured by pride, war, and arrogance, now looked inward. And all eyes, whether adorned with feathers, metal, scales, or bare skin, were drawn to a single undeniable truth. Humanity had not just survived exile. They had grown in ways the rest of the galaxy could scarcely comprehend. They had seen war, loss, betrayal, extinction, and still chose creation over destruction. Their silence had not been weakness. It had been mourning, reflection, and then a purposeful rebirth. In the months that followed the broadcast, entire sectors adopted the memory park as a model, recreating its layout in their worlds, not just as shrines to humanity, but as living declarations that peace was now a real option. The loops were studied by scholars, debated in councils, meditated upon in temples. Children began asking different questions, not about conquest, but about coexistence. And gradually, the myth of human vengeance dissolved into something more profound. The reality of human evolution. Ambassadors came to silence, but none were permitted to land. No reply came. The message had been sent. The invitation had been issued. Humanity had chosen not to rule, not to destroy, but to walk quietly among stars, waiting for the others to catch up. Not technologically, but morally. And so silence remained a quiet beacon, pulsing no longer with warning, but with potential. Every few months, the footage would update, new clips added. A child's painting. A multicultural orchestra beneath Earth's restored skies. A prosthetic-limbed veteran planting trees beside once burned cities. Humanity was healing, not with pride, but with purpose. The galaxy had expected fire, and received a mirror instead. Some species resisted, claiming it was manipulation, propaganda, weakness paraded as wisdom. But even they couldn't stop their own people from watching the loop, from seeing those human eyes full of empathy, pain, and something else. The kind of strength that didn't raise weapons, but bore the weight of restraint. Across the decades that followed, alliances realigned, not through treaties or trade deals, but through cultural shifts. Empires fell not in battle, but in irrelevance. And rising in their place were cooperative networks, loose, imperfect, but inspired. The fear of humanity became something else entirely, reverence. Not worship, but respect earned not by domination, but by choosing not to dominate. And still they said nothing. No speeches. No ceremonies. No demands. Just the ever-changing footage, like a heartbeat, reminding the galaxy of what could be. In the end, humanity's greatest weapon was not hidden technology, not secret fleets or mind-bending AI. It was something far rarer. The decision to become better, even when no one was watching. Especially then. The legacy of silence was not etched in monuments or databases, but in the slow, quiet awakening of a galaxy that had, for so long, confused power with violence. And as generations passed, and new leaders rose who had only ever known a galaxy shaped by that one signal, the name Earth ceased to be spoken in fear. It was spoken with hope, with respect, with longing. The signal had done what no war ever could. It reminded the galaxy of its own soul. And that, in the end, was humanity's final victory. Not through conquest, but through conscience. Not through silence, but what followed after. And thus silence endured, not as a threat, but as a whisper across the stars. You can be more. We chose to be. So can you. Would you like a cinematic thumbnail prompt, title screen design, or full video script format for this story next?